started. So I just wanted to say thank you to all the sponsors of the Learning Revolution Conference for making this possible and for And now we are going to go ahead and allow all of you, including ourselves, to tell us where you are from on this map. So I'm going to just mark off that we're in New Jersey, which is approximately in that area. And if you want to just share where else you are from. I have the advantage of having moderated Judy's session, so I actually do know where Andrea is from. But Andrea, if you want to use the whiteboard right now and just mark off on the map where you're from, that will help all the people who are hopefully watching this recording later to know where you are from as well. So I'll give you a second to do that. Just need to go to the menu on the left-hand side of the slide and choose the little star or whatever emoticon you want to use, and then put it on the map. So she picked the emoticon that's above the chat box, but you want the menu that's on the side of the slide. I don't know if you see that. You'll see like an arrow, a star, do you see that? Okay, well, it's all right. So I know this technology is a little new for everyone. I'm going to just let all of you know that I know that Andrea is actually from Canada. And we were really glad to have her on the session last time. So we're really happy to see her again. And welcome to everyone else who is watching Saskatchewan. Yes, Regina. Thank you. Oh, you're on the iPad. That makes sense. So for all of you who are watching the recording, I don't know where you're from, but hopefully you're from many different places and you'll get a lot out of this session with us. So I'm just going to turn off the whiteboard again. So like I said, welcome to our session on how to assess project-based learning, or PBL. Today we're going to be talking about the different ways that you can assess learning as you do project-based learning units with your students or with adults. And hopefully this will give you an idea of how you can integrate assessments more easily into your project-based learning units. Okay? So my name is Jess Chung, and I'm the Assistant Director of Education Services at Foundations, Inc. I've done project-based learning with alternative high school students and college-age students before, as well as service learning projects for K through 12 students. So I've done a lot of project-based learning, and I know that for me, assessments were actually very intimidating at first, and then as I started doing assessments and seeing different ways that we could do assessments in more fun and engaging ways for our students, it became less of a hassle and something that felt more natural in the whole project-based learning process. So I'm hoping by the end of this session you will also feel that way as well. A little bit about Foundations. If you're not familiar with us, we are a nonprofit based in New Jersey, and we work in schools, after schools, and with community-based programs. We run after-school programs in the Philadelphia area, so we try to make sure everything we do is grounded in practice. We like to test out the new ideas that we have in our programs to make sure that what we tell you is stuff that we've actually done as well. And we do capacity building in the form of professional development and technical assistance for out-of-school time programs and schools. So just a little bit about who we are and where we're coming from. Let me do this. Okay, and now we're going to do a quick poll. I would just like to know what your experience in assessing PBL is. On the top of the chat box, you'll see a letter A in a little box, and you can choose one of those options. A, I have little or no experience with PBL, much less assessing it. B, I have facilitated PBL but not sure how to assess it. Or C, I feel comfortable facilitating and assessing PBL but want to learn more. Andrea says C, that she feels comfortable with facilitating assessing PBL but she'd like to know more. So wherever you are, and Andrea, thank you for sharing, wherever you are in terms of your PBL experience, I feel like by the end of the session you will have a better idea of things that you can do. Oh, great, we have a another person on. I'm so excited. Beverly, if you want to participate in our poll as well and let us know your experience assessing PBL, you can go to the little letter that's A that's surrounded by a square, and you can choose one of the options, the drop downs A, B, or C according to your experience. So Andrea here was just saying that she is very familiar with PBL but always interested in learning what other people do. And if you want to share as well, we would really appreciate knowing where your experience level is. So why don't you go ahead and do that, and I'll just move on in terms of the slide, and then I'll check back with you. So A is little experience, B, have facilitated PBL but not sure how to assess it, and C is you're comfortable but you want to learn more. Okay. So, sorry, if you see me looking over to my side, it's because Judy is right next to me, and I'm just checking in with her to make sure that I'm good. Okay, so these are the learning objectives for today's session. We're going to understand what the assessment process looks like when we use reflective practice. We're going to learn how we can incorporate assessment throughout the PBL process rather than just doing it at the end. And I'll also give you some strategies and tools for assessing PBL in different ways, okay? And Beverly, I see that you're from New Mexico, so I'm really excited that we have people from all over on this session with us. Okay. So we're going to do a fun little exercise called the cookie taste test. Now I realize you don't necessarily have a cookie in front of you, although if you're at home or in an office with cookies, you may want to grab one right now. But if you don't have a cookie right in front of you, I want you to imagine the last chocolate chip cookie that you ate. And I want you to use this rubric to give us some feedback on what it was like. So was it fresh? Was the freshness 1, unsatisfactory, 2 or 3 in the middle, or 4 outstanding? And then just give me a comment about why you thought, what indicated to you that it was fresh, or that the chips were outstanding, or that the texture was good, or that the taste was good. So I want you to use the chat box and just type in, maybe choose one category, since doing all 4 might be hard, but choose one category and rank the last cookie you had by its freshness, chips, texture, or taste. Give it a 1, 2, 3, or 4, 1 being unsatisfactory, 4 being outstanding, and then give me a comment about why it was great or not so great. So Judy says that her freshness, she gave it a 3, and she said she knew it was fresh because her cookie was soft. So she's using soft as an indicator of freshness. Great. Judy said she also liked the cookie because it was a 3, it was soft. Beverly likes cookies that have lots of chips, so she gave it a 4. That's really helpful to know. So Beverly likes chocolate chip cookies with lots of chips. And anyone else want to share what makes their chocolate chip cookie good in terms of freshness, chips, texture, and taste? Now normally when I would do this in an in-person training, we would actually give you a chocolate chip cookie, but unfortunately, since we're doing this online, we can't do that with you. Okay, so the reason why we do this specific rubric to start off this session is not just to get you thinking about chocolate chip cookies. Oh, okay, Andrea says she'll be the instigator. She'll say chips 1, too many chips, not enough cookies. So you want to taste the cookie, so that's very helpful to know too, right? So we all have a different range of opinions. The reason we like to start out the session with a rubric like this is we like to show staff and students that rubrics and assessments don't have to be scary or complicated, but they can actually be fun to participate in. And they can be very straightforward, and you can use a rubric to assess almost anything. It doesn't have to be just learning, but it could be a product like a chocolate chip cookie. So this is a great activity to just introduce people to the idea of assessments if it's something that's intimidating for them. And you'll see that on the slide there is an asterisk that indicates that this is a handout that we can make available to you at the end of the webinar. And later on I'll be sharing my email so that you can email me if you would like a copy of the handouts. So that is something that will be available to you. And actually I'll ask Judy right now to type in my email for you so you'll have it on hand. And that way you can email me. Great. So I mentioned earlier that we're going to use the reflective practice approach to assessing PBL. And what reflective practice is, it really looks at 3 questions. It was developed in order to assess experiential learning, which PBL is a type of experiential learning, right? Because it's an authentic approach to learning that requires students to answer a question and then come up with a solution to a real-world problem. So the 3 questions that you answer in the reflective practice approach is what did we do and what did we learn? So what, what did we gain and what did others gain from that? And what's next? What is the next step, or how do we expand on the learning that we've done? Okay, so we're going to get into that a little more in depth, and we'll talk about the different assessments that fit into each part of the reflective practice approach. Just to get us all on the same page when I say project-based learning or PBL, just so you know what I mean, the Buck Institute for Education, when they look at PBL, they're looking at something that really focuses on academic content and that makes a connection to core content knowledge as you're doing the project. So not to say that projects can't be fun, but they really should have some sort of educational goal. Alongside that, we want to make sure we're developing 21st century skills in our project-based learning units. So we're thinking about collaboration, team building, critical thinking, higher learning skills, all creativity, all those great things that our students will need in order to be successful in the real world and in their future jobs and careers. The emphasis in a PBL unit is really around answering that driving question. It's really the key to any project is to have a good driving question. Project-based learning units are all about encouraging the youth voice and choice of the students. We want to make sure that the projects are student-driven and that students are also learning through iteration, right? Project-based learning units are great in that they allow students to fail, but in a safe way that allows them to use their failures as a way of learning and to reflect and to revise accordingly. So failure becomes not something that's necessarily negative, but something that leads to better answers and more creativity in a lot of ways. So why should we assess project-based learning? Well, the research on high-quality project-based learning says that, just like I said earlier, it builds academic and 21st century skills, but it also increases motivation and engagement for the students who do it, and it leads to higher long-term retention in terms of learning. So if we want to make all these claims that our project-based learning units are building academic and 21st century skills and that they're making our students more motivated in school and causing them to retain more knowledge and skills, we need to actually assess our PBL units and make sure that it's actually happening, right? We don't want to make an empty claim. Just doing a project with a student, it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll get all these results. So we want a way to collect that that evidence. And Andrea, definitely project-based learning is a yes to motivation engagement. We do want our students to know that learning can be fun, that learning is something that we can do our whole lives and be really excited about, right? So this is a little more complicated version of the PBL process than maybe what you have seen. And the reason why it's broken down like this, normally you'll see it in 5 steps, but the reason we've broken it down a little more is it helps us to think about where assessments fit in. So really when you look at this, you're looking at the planning and preparation for doing a project, which includes thinking about students' needs and students' interests and community needs, and then coming up with a driving question, which will ask students to find a solution to a real-world problem or issue, and then actually engaging students in that project, engaging them also in doing different types of assessments that will lead to a better answer to their driving question, developing a rubric and a timeline to assess the product of that project-based learning unit, as well as how much time you want to spend on that project. Helping students by helping them manage their time and implement the different parts of the project they need to complete in order to share and present what they've done and document the learning that they have completed, and then to spend some time in reflection over everything that they've done and where they want to go next. So that's essentially the PBL process, and I'll refer back to different steps throughout the session so that you'll remember all the steps and you'll see where the assessments fit in. I mentioned this earlier, but again, just to remind you what we'll be looking at in terms of assessments throughout the session. First, we're going to be looking at the what. So what did you or what did students learn and what did they do as part of the project? And this really fits with the first two steps, as you'll see, of the PBL process, the planning and preparation, as well as coming up with a driving question. And then the so what did we gain and what did others gain? And this fits with the next three steps, which are engaging the students, coming up with a rubric, and managing and implementing the project. And finally, the what's next, which fits with the share and present and the reflection. So what issue or problem does it make sense to tackle next, okay? So if you were on the session with Judy, you probably already saw this document. It's our documenting and assessing learning checklist. And what it does is it gives you a sense of the different types of tools you can use to both document and assess learning. When it comes to documenting learning, we're really talking about presentations, portfolios, and products, right? But when it comes to assessing learning, we're looking specifically at three different types of assessments. We're looking at pre and post surveys. So what did students, what new knowledge and skills did students acquire throughout the project? Checklists and logs. What core content standards or knowledge did they or skills did they use, and what 21st century skills did they use as well. And then rubrics to assess the quality of the product and the presentation that they complete, okay? So let's take a look at those first two steps that I talked about before, the what. So, you know, what assessments can you do as you plan and prepare a project-based learning unit and come up with a good driving question. So what I've done here is I've given you a real issue that some of the students in Florida that we've worked with before have come up with. So here is an example. So say you're starting to plan and prepare for a project-based unit and your students tell you that they're interested in addressing health issues because they've learned that their community suffers from a high rate of diabetes, right? So what do you do from here? Well, what you can do is actually look up some quick research, right, on things about diabetes that might interest the students and give them a starting point. So some of the facts that we picked up on were that 10% of Floridians have diabetes, that type 2 diabetes is nearing epidemic proportions because of the prevalence of obesity and sedentary lifestyles, and that healthy eating can prevent or delay the onset of type 2 diabetes among high-risk adults. So what came to mind for us was to take these facts on diabetes and then combine that, the idea of studying nutrition and studying health with the cookie taste test that we did earlier. So we've come to our first Chatbox challenge, and in this portion of the session, I want you to actually type your answer to the question on the slide. So earlier, some of you did the cookie taste test, and I would like you to think about how could you combine learning about health and nutrition with an activity like the cookie taste test. So in the cookie taste test, you guys assessed a chocolate chip cookie that you've eaten recently based on its freshness, its chips, its texture, and its taste. So I'd like you to know, if you had students like the ones in Florida that we worked with who are interested in addressing diabetes, how would you combine their interest in health to an activity like an assessment like the cookie taste test to come up with a good project? Judy says you could explore the ingredients of cookies and see what's good and what's bad for your body. Right, so maybe you could come up with a question about, you know, what is the nutritional value, or how can we make cookies, how can we make the argument that cookies are good for you? Right, what else could you do? Like, what kind of question could you come up with that students could explore that might combine eating cookies with health and nutrition? And there's no necessarily right or wrong answer. And I know Judy is typing away, but I want to encourage one person on the webinar to be brave and maybe come up with an idea of a project that you could do. And I'll share some of the ideas we have. Log your consumption of eating cookies and others to determine how that relates to health. That's a great idea, right? So we could do a question like, how does the consumption of cookies lead to either better or worse health? So that might be a good question to ask, right, to make a correlation. So that's actually a research project as well. I like that idea. Consumption and effects. That's a great idea. So that's a great idea, and it's one that I would encourage you to explore if you think it would interest your students. This is the question that actually came up for our students in Florida, was they came up with this idea of how can we create a chocolate chip cookie that is safe for diabetics but still delicious? So how can we come up with a cookie that has some nutritional value, that is safe for diabetics to eat, but would encourage them to also do some healthy eating. Now, as you look at this question, I'd like you to type in your chat box, what kind of assessments do you think we could do as students explore this driving question? What are some of the things we want to capture as they answer this question? What learning do we want to assess as they answer this question? Is it doable? Okay. So we might want to actually assess the driving question first and find out if it's narrow and measurable enough to do. But what other learning could we assess related to health and nutrition? I'll give you a few seconds to think about that. Think about the reflective practice that I was talking about, the what, the so what, and what's next. You know, what did we do? What did we learn? What would we assess? Okay, maybe this is a really hard question to answer, so I'll give you some suggestions, right? Maybe what we need to know or we need to assess are, here we go, does it meet curricular outcomes and have students involved? Well, that's definitely something we want to know, and that's actually on this list right of the slide, right? What did students learn and what did they do? Okay, but maybe one thing we would like to assess is what did students know about diabetes before this project and what did they know after? What did they learn to do? So that could include, Andrea, I agree, you know, did they learn some skills that will be important to their doing better in school? Did they also maybe learn things that will help them live a better life, like how to cook, how to measure, right? And then final product as well, maybe we want an assessment that looks at the quality of the product that they come up with or the response that they create, okay? And so if we look at these three things, you know, what did students know before and then after the project, what did students learn and what did they do, and the quality of the final product that they create, we're really talking about three different types of assessments. We're looking at the pre and post surveys to measure new knowledge and skills acquired, right? We're talking about checklists and logs to log the learning that was done and what was, learning what was, sorry, I'm looking down because I'm looking at the chat box. To log the results of what was learned and done, and then rubrics to assess the quality of the product. So Andrea says, Tony says RAND folder is good for this, activating prior knowledge and what wonderings they have. Great. So that's definitely a resource you should check out. Oh, I went blurry for a second. Let me see if I can fix that. Is that better? Yeah. So definitely share resources in the chat box as I type as well. That's why we have Judy here to moderate the chat box, okay? So let's investigate some of these assessments, though, that I've brought up on the slide. Okay, so let's first talk about pre and post surveys. This is probably a assessment that you're very familiar with already, the idea of assessing what students already know, like Andrea said, activating prior knowledge, right, so that they can think about what they already know and then how they can add to that prior knowledge, and then evaluating what knowledge and skills were gained as a result of the learning that we did, right? So some tips for creating a pre and post survey is that you obviously want to use the same survey at the beginning and at the end so that you have a clear list of answers that will help you determine the growth of your students in terms of learning. We would suggest you keep pre and post surveys short, simple, and open-ended. So use open-ended questions. I would suggest not using more than 5 questions, although some people say less than 10, but just don't make it overwhelming. And also, this is something you may not think about, but don't make it feel like a pop quiz for your kids. if we don't tie it necessarily to a grade, but this idea that we really just want to know where you are. What do you know about this topic, so that we can get a better sense of what we need to investigate and what we need to learn in order to answer the driving question. I think that's really important because we want this to be a positive experience for our kids, and we want them to see pre and post assessments as just a tool to guide the learning and to help them to know what they need to do, right? So Andrea says formative assessment throughout, right? So we're taking, it's almost like taking the temperature of a student in terms of their learning, right? It's not necessarily we're not giving them a grade for their pre and post survey. Exactly. Thank you, Jenny. Right. It's not tied to grades. So here's a Chatbox challenge for you. I'd like to know, what is a survey question that would assess the knowledge students gained from a project like the Diabetes-Friendly Cookie Project? So if students were creating a diabetes-friendly cookie, what is a survey question that you could ask that would assess whether they've gained knowledge as a result of the project? What would be a good question? So go ahead and type that in the chat box. What are some cookie ingredients that are diabetes friendly? Great. Right, so what are some common ingredients in cookies that are diabetes friendly? Andrea says yes. What other questions could you ask? Anything else? How can you make a cookie more diabetes friendly, right? That's almost like the driving question, so maybe we want to break that down a little bit. Maybe what types of foods are safe for diabetics would be another way to rephrase that question, Jenny, right? What did you learn from doing this project? Well, that's not really a pre and post survey question, right, Judy? I mean, that might be more of a reflection question. I'm putting Judy on the spot because she's right next to me, because they wouldn't be able to answer that question at the beginning of the project, right? So some other examples might be, what is diabetes? What is type 2 diabetes? What contributes to type 2 diabetes, right? Right, what do you know about diabetes? And I like that question because then it leaves it a little more open, right? So what do you know about diabetes currently? And if you ask that again at the end, hopefully they'll have a much longer answer, a much more in-depth answer about that. Why is it important to have diabetes-friendly food? Exactly. So these are all great questions, and these are all examples of questions you could use if you were to do this project. And just so you know, I'm going to continue using this example so that we have sort of a common thread throughout this session. So now that we talked a little bit about the what, how do we plan and prepare and do an assessment in the beginning of the project that will sort of give us a sense of where students are. We're going to talk about the so what did students gain and what did others gain. And just so you know, I know this is a little contrived because the engaging students portion and the assessments that we do are going to overlap between the what and the so what, but I wanted to break up the session in a way that would make sense, okay? So engaging students. So something that came up in our What is Project-Based Learning session that I'd like to reiterate here is that it's really important for us to involve students in creating the assessments that they'll use. And to get them involved in general in creating assessments, because then they better understand how to analyze what's happening and what they're learning, okay? So I think part of engaging students in the project-based learning unit is actually having them create different assessments. And we can really easily do that in a way that captures what they're gaining and what others are gaining. So as we look at this question of how can we create a chocolate chip cookie that is safe for diabetics and still delicious, there are different things that students will need to assess, right? They'll need to assess, what do people consider delicious? What is actually safe for diabetics? What did we try as we tried to answer this question? And how do we know that we've succeeded in answering this question? These are all questions that they'll need to be able to come up with the answer with in order to come up with a final product for this project. So these are some of the assessments that they can help you come up with. They can help you come up with a delicious cookie survey. And it might look a lot like the cookie taste test, but they might decide that there are other factors in what makes a delicious cookie other than freshness, the number of chips, texture, and taste, right? They may come up with other factors. Also, they'll need to create a safe recipe checklist. If they're going to find a recipe for a diabetes-friendly cookie or make a diabetes-friendly cookie, they'll need to know what are things that would be safe to put in a recipe and what are ways that we can make a recipe safer. They'll need to keep track of the different recipes that they are actually testing. And then finally, they'll need to come up with some sort of rubric to determine whether their product really can compare to a chocolate chip cookie that people like that is not diabetes friendly, right? So that it's assessing the quality of their final product. And these are all things, like I said, that you can engage students in doing. So let's take a deeper look at some of these assessments. First of all, you want to give students a good idea of what a rubric looks like and how they can develop one. So these are just 3 easy steps for creating a rubric. First, you'll want to identify what criteria you have. So we saw that earlier in the cookie taste test. The criteria were freshness, the number of chips in the cookie, texture, and taste. So that you can use that as an example for starting to create your own rubric about how to assess the quality of a diabetes-friendly cookie, right? You can even use similar criteria. Then you want to create levels of competency. So how well did you reach the goal that you wanted to meet? In this case, you see a rubric. The rubric you're seeing on the slide is a presentation rubric that the Buck Institute for Education created for K through 2 students on presentation. So you see that their levels of competency are very friendly. You have still learning sometimes and almost always. And in this criteria was I planned the beginning, middle, and at the end. So something that's fun for kids is to actually come up with the levels of competency and maybe come up with little icons that will denote how well they did, right? And I just want to take a look quickly at the chat box because I see we have a lot of activity here. Andrea also agrees that kids are good at co-creating rubrics or criteria and that it adds to their ownership and engagement. I definitely agree with that, right? Because then they understand what they're actually assessing, what the targets are. And like I said, you want to create an assignment of value to each level that makes sense to the students. And the more input that they have in that assignment of value, the better. And sometimes students will be harder on themselves than you would be. So you can guide them in that process as well. Oh, definitely, Jenny. I will. This is a handout that we will include. If you would like, what we'll do is you just need to email me, or actually I saw that Judy was writing down your email, and we will send this handout to you as well as the other handouts from this webinar. And if we forget to do that, you can email me. Judy, just type my email in the chat box. Okay? This is also a great tool online that you can use to create rubrics. And I'm actually going to give you a quick web tour of this. So if you are not able to see what I pull up, I will tell you what let me get it going here. There we go. Okay, so where I'm going is RubiStar.forteachers.org. And I see that some people are already familiar with this website, okay? This is a great website to create rubrics, and I'm just going to show you one that you can use for this cookie project. And Judy, if you could, it's not RubiStar.com, sorry, it's RubiStar.forteachers.org. There we go. Okay, so let me just show you the rubric that I would start with for the cookie project. So I would go to Science, down here on the bottom left, and then go to Building of Structure. So I did some investigating here. And then you may have to actually scroll down because I don't think I can scroll down for you here. So if you scroll down to the area that says Creating and Editing Your Rubric, you'll see that you can pick different categories. So one category is modification and testing, and you'll see that it fills up your rubric with different levels of competency. And you can actually edit these levels of competency to specifically customize it for your product. So for example, this says number 4 would indicate clear evidence of troubleshooting, testing, and refinements based on data or scientific principles. So what you could do for this rubric, if you were assessing the quality of a product or, the learning that students did with the cookie project, you could say clear evidence of testing different types of diabetes-friendly recipes, something like that, right? You could make different levels of whether students showed that they were actually learning and logging what they did, okay? So it looks like we have other resources in the chat box for creating rubrics, so definitely share with one another those things. I just wanted to give you a specific resource that we've used for projects. And you can take a look at the different categories here as well. We have data collection, information gathering, plan. So this is a rubric that we would use for this specific project, but I encourage you to go onto the website and look at the different customizable rubrics they have. And this will take a lot of the work out for you and give your students a place to start in terms of helping to create the rubric, because then they can use, they can create their own language for the rubric as well. So I'm going to go back to our slides. Okay, so you created a rubric, and now you will actually want to start the project doing, the meat of the project. And throughout this, you also want to make sure that you are doing some assessments so that when you get to the end, you'll already have information on what students have learned and what they've done. So these are some of the steps you could take in terms of doing assessments that's in a way that's integrated into the rest of the project. First, you could administer the cookie taste test with some cookies in general. Maybe they're not diabetes friendly, just to get a sense of what people think is delicious, right? Then you could review information on diabetes-friendly baking so that students have an idea of how they can create a checklist to determine what cookie recipes would be safe or how they could make a common chocolate chip cookie recipes safer. And then they would test those safe recipes, so they would actually make those and then log the process and the results using the rubric that they created for their diabetes-friendly cookie. So let's take a deeper look at each of these steps. So in terms of creating a checklist, first you want to make sure you give students a resource that they can use to create the checklist. So here I pulled up an article that I found on 10 tips for baking wisely. It's from the Diabetes Health magazine online, and it gives 10 tips for how you can make different cookie recipes or baking recipes safer for diabetics. So this was the resource that we gave a bunch of program directors and staff in order to help them help their students create a checklist. So what they took this checklist and they picked, this resource, they picked 4 things that they thought students could handle. So in this case, they created a checklist with 4 determinations for a safer cookie recipe. They said a safe recipe cuts the carbohydrate count of a normal cookie recipe like the Toll House cookies by reducing the sugar content by 1/4. It substitutes sugar with a sweetener to lower the glycemic index. Something like agave nectar would be an example of a sweetener that would do that. It uses whole wheat flour, and it cuts fats in other ways besides substituting butter with margarine. Okay, so those were the criteria that came up for the checklist. It could look different for your project. I'm not saying that this is a checklist you'd have to use, but these were the things they thought would work given the kind of project they wanted to do. So after they created this checklist, they then had students start using this checklist to analyze different recipes. So here you see an example of 2 recipes that students had to analyze to determine which recipe was safer according to their checklist. So I'm going to challenge you to take a look at these 2 recipes and type in the chat box which one you think is the safer recipe for diabetics. I'm not necessarily saying either recipe is safe. I'm just saying which one do you think is safer according to the checklist that I just reviewed that the students in Florida created. And this is a good way to check if students were learning or if the people on this webinar were listening. So just to remind you what was on the checklist, and I'll go back very briefly. All right, take a good look, right? So reduces sugar, substitutes sugar with sweetener to lower glycemic index. And again, maybe the recipes that I show you won't meet all of the guidelines on the checklist. Uses whole wheat flour and then cuts fats in ways other than substituting butter with margarine. Okay, we have 2 for BEVs, 1 for very fast, 3 for BEVs. All right. So the majority of you are right. It is BEV's chocolate chip cookies that is a little safer for diabetics. I wouldn't say this is a perfect recipe, but it's a good way for students to start testing out their checklists and their assessments of recipes. And it's a way for them to learn how to use an assessment, as well as a way for you to see if they're learning, if they're coming up with something that's actually useful to them, okay? So again, just a way to integrate assessments as you start doing your projects. And then you want to start logging what students are doing. So this is an example of something we call a graffiti wall. It's from one of our publications on STEM. But it's also a great way for students to do some math and use some of those math skills and knowledge as they're working. So the example here was they chose Bev's chocolate chip cookie recipe as the safer recipe for diabetics, and then they wanted to actually test it out and see what people thought of the recipe of the cookie in terms of taste and whether it could stand up to a chocolate chip cookie that's not safe for diabetics. The original recipe only makes 2.5 dozen cookies, and the size of the programs that are being served in Florida were much larger. They served about over 100 people. So one of the things that students had to log was they had to convert the recipe to feed 120 people, and they had to log how they converted the recipe. So this is just a way to capture some of the other learning that's going on. As students do things, they're going to have to maybe make calculations or do other types of assessments, and you can capture that in really fun ways. In this case, with a graffiti wall that we've created, which again will be available to you at the end of the webinar. You just need to email me, and I'll provide my email at the end. But this was just an example of a way you can log activities and log learning, okay? And Stephanie, I'm glad that you like it. Yeah, I mean, and the fun thing is you can also use this kind of assessment even for event planning with your students as well. Say, you're putting on a multicultural food event, and they bring in a recipe that only feeds 4, and you need to feed 50 people. You can have them help you do the calculations for how much food needs to, that food needs to be bought in order to have that party or something like that. So we're going to have one more Chatbox challenge. I believe this is the last Chatbox challenge. I want you to identify some of the academic skills and 21st century skills that you saw students developing as a result or gaining as a result of this project, just from the assessments that we looked at and the things that they would be doing. And this is a good as a sort of debrief tool. You could write these things down on a piece of chart paper and have your staff think about, oh, okay, what academic skills are students actually exhibiting or using as they do this project? What 21st century skills are they exhibiting? Okay, Beverly says math conversion, right? Also, I was thinking, measuring, because they're actually going to be baking the cookies that they're testing, so they'll have to learn different types of measurements as well. Judy says writing. What else? Maybe what 21st century skills, and just to remind you, an example of 21st century skill would be collaboration or creativity. So what other skills were they working on? I'll give a few more seconds for people to type. Collaboration, Stephanie says definitely. Research, thank you. Yeah, that's a great one, right? They had to do a little research. Maybe instead of you providing the different informational documents on diabetes, they need to do their own research for that, right? So these are some of the other skills that we identified in this project, that they had to analyze information as well as find information, Stephanie, like you said, that they had to modify and test, so experiment would be another way of, writing it down. Logging results has to do with writing, right? Number operations, critical thinking, and then following directions is also a 21st century skill, right? So they can find a great recipe, but then if they don't follow the directions in order, when they test the recipe correctly, they may come out with a somewhat disastrous result. So we did that way they learn the importance of actually following directions. Okay, so we talked about the what and the so what, right? What did they learn? What did they do? What did they gain? What did others gain? And now we'll look at the now what. Now that we've created a product, what are the next steps? So those steps in the PBL process are to share and present the learning and then to reflect on the learning. So let's take a look here. So we have here some ways of thinking about how to share and present learning. But definitely the final product, you want to make sure you showcase that in some way, and the best way to do that a lot of times is to have some sort of culminating event, and also maybe have students present on what they learned and what they did during the project. So let's come up with some ideas of culminating events that where students could present their final product, their diabetes-friendly cookie. What would be some good culminating events for that? And Judy, I'm going to ask you to hold off on typing and allow some other people to type, because I think people, I want to challenge the people in the chat box to do that. So I know Judy has a bunch of good ideas. Okay, so Stephanie says maybe arrange a taste test at a local bakery. That's a great idea, right? So that's what I like about that idea, Stephanie, too, is you're starting to build connections with the community and maybe build potential partnerships, right? So maybe a local bakery could highlight the cookie that your students came up with. It could be like a special during the week or something like that. So at the table at a grocery store. What else could you do to present and share the product that your students came up with, or products? Sell them, right? Have a bake sale, raise some money for your program or school. Take it further, find more recipes, make a blog, create a webinar, right? Have your kids teach other kids and teach other staff what they did, talk about their project, share their learning that way. Big scales, share health info as well. So, kids could create not just a PowerPoint presentation, maybe posters, right, marketing for their product that would reflect some of that health info that they picked up throughout. Another idea that I've heard before for this project is to actually create a cookie cookbook full of diabetes-friendly recipes. So not just have one recipe, but many recipes that they could share with their community to make it a free cookbook, right? Send the project and have them design the box that we package. And those are all great ideas. As you think about the culminating event and how to present that final product, don't forget to do the post survey as well. Sometimes in our excitement about the final product and the culminating event, we can forget to do that. So we definitely want to make sure we do that. Service learning opportunities are great too. Thank you for pointing that out, Judy. Maybe one of the things you could do is make a bunch of those cookies and take it to a local nursing home or somewhere where people need some interaction and where kids can do some intergenerational relationship building. Find another health issue, research and conduct via different lens. So that's great, Andrea, because it leads to the final part of the PBL process, which is to reflect, right? So some of the good questions to ask, and again, this will be available to you, is, was the project harder or easier than you thought? What made it harder or easier? What would you do differently next time? Which then leads to this idea of, if we were to do this again, what twist could we put on it, or what would we do to make it a little bit different? So I like Andrea's idea of taking on another health issue, right? And what did you learn most about? So those are some good reflection questions. I would also ask, how can we expand on the learning that we've already done? Take this further, make it bigger. And I like this idea that a lot of you had about bringing in more learning around entrepreneurship, really teaching kids how to take the learning further in a way that will also build their job skills as well. Okay, so some additional resources for you in case you're not using these already. Edutopia has a great website with lots of resources for project-based learning, as does the Buck Institute for Education, which I referenced a few times during this session. And Youth Learn also has some great resources as well. So these are the things that we covered today. And if you have any questions now, I'd be happy to take them. You can either type them into the chat box, or if you raise your hand and you have audio up, if you're able to do audio, I can enable your audio so you can ask the question directly to me. So we have a few minutes. We have about 5 minutes before we need to exit this room so the next presentation can go. So definitely raise your hand if you have any questions, or just put it into the chat box. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. If you have to leave, then what I'll do is I will just share quickly with you our social media information and our website information, because we'd love for you to check out our website. There are project-based learning resources there. You can also tweet us at foundations_Inc. My Twitter handle is also jchungfdns. I'll just type it in right here. So you can also tweet me directly, and then you can like us on Facebook. We actually have a Facebook campaign right now where you can download free resources around literacy and global learning as well. So we'd love for you to check those out. Thank you so much for joining us today. Like I said, you can email me. I'll just bring it back here to my email. You can email me if you have any questions or you would like the handouts if you haven't shared your email already. I'm going to stop the recording, and I hope you have a great rest of the Learning Revolution Conference. Thanks so much.